quiet gallery of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, within a climate-controlled case lined in muted linen, rests a clay tablet no larger than an open palm. It was catalogued in the early 20th century after arriving in England among a shipment of artefacts excavated at Nippur in southern Mesopotamia. The excavation itself had been conducted under the direction of the University of Pennsylvania between 1889 and 1900, during seasons marked by careful stratigraphic recording and the slow lifting of earth from layered urban debris. The tablet bears a museum registration number assigned shortly after its acquisition, its edges chipped, its surface impressed with compact rows of cuneiform signs, pressed into wet clay more than 4,000 years ago. The tablet's provenience, recorded in field notes and later referenced in earlier Geological publications, places it within a temple archive complex associated with scribal activity. Its clay composition matches the alluvial soil of the Euphrates basin, fine-grained and tempered with small inclusions. When first examined by scholars in the early 1900s, its script was identified as Sumerian, written in a mature form of cuneiform that suggests an old Babylonian copy of a far older original. The lines are methodical, the columns deliberate, the scribe's hand steady. Mainstream interpretation regards this tablet as part of a broader corpus of administrative or historiographical material. Its text references kings, cities and periods of rule, situating itself within the intellectual world of early Mesopotamian record-keeping, and nothing in its appearance suggests dramatic revelation. It is one among thousands of tablets excavated from Nippur, and other ancient sites. It participates in the ordinary labour of writing, listing, counting, preserving memory, and yet, within several lines of its inscription, certain chronological references quietly extend further into the past than one might expect. The reigns enumerated in its text, particularly those attributed to rulers before a great flood event, are measured not in decades but in spans that stretch into centuries. Modern scholarship typically understands these figures as symbolic, or as products of a different numerical logic. Still, the structure of the sequence, its internal consistency, its deliberate ordering, suggests intention rather than careless exaggeration. Yes, scholars who have translated the tablet have approached it with caution, aware of the complexities of Sumerian numeration and mytho-historical layering. They have compared it with parallel manuscripts in other collections, noting variants and scribal adjustments. The consensus remains measured. The text reflects a cultural memory shaped by theological and political purposes. Yet even within that framework it preserves something older, a horizon of time that seems to reach beyond the conventional boundaries of early urban civilization. To stand before this small object in Oxford is to encounter not mystery in a sensational sense, but duration. The clay retains the imprint of fingers that pressed meaning into its surface. The tablet travelled from a Mesopotamian temple archive, through excavation trenches, across seas, into a museum case. It has been handled by curators, translated by philologists, cited in footnotes. It is grounded in documentation and method. If you find value in this kind of careful, unhurried exploration, where objects speak through context rather than spectacle, you may wish to continue listening in future studies. There is no urgency in that choice, only the quiet invitation to follow evidence where it leads, at its own pace. Within the subdued lighting of the gallery, the tablet rests unchanged, its surface carrying forward a record of names and reigns that seem to echo from a time before time was measured as we measure it now. Its authority lies not in dramatic claims, but in its persistence, and it is there, in that persistence, that our inquiry begins. Long before the tablet reached its glass case in Oxford, it lay buried within the layered earth of Nippur, an ancient city situated between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. In the closing years of the 19th century, expeditions organised by the University of Pennsylvania began systematic excavations at the site. Between 1889 and 1900, teams of archaeologists, workmen and local labourers cut trenches through accumulated mounds, exposing mud brick architecture, temple platforms, and archive rooms filled with tablets stacked or scattered in collapsed strata. The methods employed were developing but deliberate. Stratigraphy, though not yet as refined as in modern archaeology, guided the recording of layers. Field notes documented depth, orientation, and associated artifacts. Tablets were often found in concentrated deposits, sometimes in jars, sometimes in rooms identified as scribal chambers. The context of discovery was recognized as essential to interpretation. A tablet's meaning was not limited to its inscription. It was also shaped by its position within a sequence of occupation. As these artifacts reached Philadelphia and other academic centres, a new discipline began to cohere. Assyriology emerged from the combined efforts of philologists, historians, and archaeologists, who sought to decipher cuneiform script and reconstruct Mesopotamian chronology. Early pioneers laboured over sign lists, grammatical patterns, and bilingual inscriptions that offered clues to translation. Each deciphered line refined the emerging framework of Sumerian history. From these efforts, a foundational chronology took shape. Urbanization in southern Mesopotamia was placed in the 4th millennium BCE, with writing appearing around 3200 BCE during the Uruk period. Dynastic sequences were assembled from inscriptions and king lists. Flood layers identified in certain strata were interpreted as local events within the broader environmental history of the region. The discipline established a cautious but coherent narrative, Sumer as one of humanity's earliest cradles of complex civilization. Yet even within this structured academic development, minor chronological tensions appeared. Certain textual traditions seem to preserve memories of earlier eras not easily aligned with archaeological strata. Some king lists referenced antediluvian rulers whose reign lengths defied conventional temporal scaling. Rather than rejecting such material, scholars often categorized it as mythic preface to historical record. This interpretive approach did not arise from dismissal, but from methodological discipline. Archaeology privileges material evidence. Philology weighs linguistic patterns. Chronology depends upon cross-reference data. When textual claims extended beyond excavated layers, they were placed within symbolic or literary categories. The boundaries of what could be affirmed were carefully maintained. Thus, Sumerology matured as a field grounded in caution. It built its authority not through dramatic revision, but through accumulation of data. And yet, within its archives, tablets remained that hinted at a deeper antiquity. The discipline acknowledged them, translated them, footnoted them, while retaining a measured distance from their more expansive chronological implications. In this way, the excavation trenches at Nippur did more than uncover clay tablets. They established the parameters within which those tablets would be read. The birth of Sumerology shaped the lens through which early civilization is still understood today. Structured, evidence-based, and attentive to limits, even when the texts themselves appear to stretch beyond them. Within the framework established by more than a century of archaeological research, the rise of civilization in southern Mesopotamia follows a carefully constructed timeline. The Ubaid period, extending back into the 6th millennium BCE, reveals early village communities, irrigation practices, and temple precursors. This is followed by the Uruk period, beginning around 4000 BCE, during which settlements expanded into urban centres, administrative complexity increased, and monumental architecture began to define the landscape. By approximately 3200 BCE, writing appears in the form of proto-cuneiform tablets, initially economic in nature, concerned with grain rations, livestock counts, and labour allocations. From this foundation, the early dynastic period unfolds. City-states such as Ur, Uruk, Lagash, and Kish emerge as political entities with identifiable rulers. Royal inscriptions, votive offerings, and administrative texts create a textured historical record. Chronology is refined through cross-referencing king lists, archaeological strata, and, in later periods, synchronisms with neighbouring regions. Radiocarbon dating, ceramic typology, and stratigraphic sequencing reinforce the general outline. The academic consensus, while subject to refinement, remains stable in its broad contours. Parallel to developments in Mesopotamia, the Nile Valley witnesses its own transformation. Pre-dynastic communities consolidate along the river, and by around 3100 BCE, Upper and Lower Egypt are unified under a centralised kingship. Monumental architecture and hieroglyphic writing appear within a relatively compressed historical window. As a result, Egypt and Mesopotamia are often described as near-parallel cradles of civilization, distinct yet contemporaneous in their early complexity. This model, supported by extensive excavation and documentation, situates the emergence of organised urban life firmly within the 4th millennium BCE. Prior periods are characterised as Neolithic or Chalcolithic, marked by gradual agricultural development rather than fully articulated state structures. The narrative emphasises continuity and incremental growth rather than abrupt civilizational rupture. And yet, within this orderly chronology, scholars occasionally note the presence of proto-urban precursors. These refer to settlements that display signs of organisation beyond simple village life. Structured layouts, communal storage, ritual spaces, without meeting the criteria for full urbanism. Such precursors suggest that complexity may have been developing in subtle forms before the visible threshold of city life was crossed. The concept remains cautiously framed. Archaeology relies upon material thresholds, writing, monumental construction, administrative centralization. Without these, it is difficult to label a society as fully civilized in the conventional sense. Still, the existence of transitional phases invites reflection on what might have preceded the well-documented rise of Sumerian and Egyptian states. Within mainstream scholarship, there is no assertion of a forgotten global empire predating these civilizations. Instead, there is acknowledgement of gradual processes, layered development, and occasional gaps in the record. It is within those gaps, geological, textual, or interpretive, that quiet questions sometimes arise. Not questions of dramatic upheaval, but of duration. How long did complexity gestate before it left unmistakable traces? The established chronology remains persuasive, grounded in decades of excavation and interdisciplinary analysis. Yet the very discipline that constructed this framework also recognises that the past is often more continuous than our categories allow. Between the first villages and the first cities lies a spectrum of possibility, still being explored with careful hands and patient scholarship. Among the textual artefacts recovered from Mesopotamian sites, few have attracted as much sustained scholarly attention as the Sumerian king list. Preserved in multiple manuscript copies, including the well-known Weld Blundell prism housed in Oxford, the text presents itself as a sequential record of kingship, descending from heaven and passing from city to city. Its structure is orderly. Cities are named, rulers are enumerated, and reign lengths are recorded with numerical precision. On the surface, it appears to function as a historiographical document, organising political succession into a single linear narrative. The surviving copies vary in detail and arrangement, yet they share a recognisable framework. Kingship begins in a primordial city, often Eridu, and proceeds through a succession of urban centres: Bad Tibera, Larak, Sippar, Shurupak. Before a flood event interrupts the sequence, a set of rulers is listed with reigns extending into extraordinary durations. Alulim of Eridu, for example, is said to have ruled for 28,800 years. Subsequent kings are assigned similarly expansive spans, sometimes measured in tens of thousands of years. From a modern perspective, such numbers appear implausible if interpreted literally. Assyriologists have therefore approached them with methodological restraint. The Sumerian numerical system operated on a sexagesimal base, incorporating symbolic and astronomical associations. Some scholars suggest that the large figures may reflect schematic multiplication, calendrical cycles, or theological symbolism rather than chronological reporting in our contemporary sense. The text's mathematical regularities support this view. The totals of reigns before the flood often conform to structured patterns rather than arbitrary exaggeration. After the flood narrative, the king list shifts tone. Reign lengths contract dramatically, aligning more closely with plausible human lifespans. The sequence becomes increasingly anchored to historically verifiable rulers whose inscriptions appear in archaeological contexts. In this way, the document bridges mythic prehistory and documented dynastic history. It functions not merely as a list, but as a narrative device connecting divine origins to terrestrial governance. The problem arises in the transition itself. Why preserve an ordered sequence of antediluvian rulers at all? If the compilers intended purely symbolic prefaces, they did so with remarkable internal consistency. The repetition of numerical structures across manuscript copies suggests reliance on earlier exemplars. Scribes copied the list with care, even when its earliest entries described reigns that stretched far beyond ordinary chronology. One interpretation suggests that the exaggerated reigns served to elevate the antiquity of kingship, grounding political authority in a sacred and immeasurable past. Another way to read the text is as a compressed memory of a distant era, encoded in symbolic numeration. The flood dividing the antediluvian from the post-diluvian periods introduces a structural boundary, an event marking rupture and renewal. It is important to emphasize that mainstream scholarship does not treat the pre-flood kings as literal historical figures ruling for millennia. Rather, the king list is understood as a composite text, blending theology, political legitimation, and historiography. Yet the persistence of its early sections invites contemplation. The scribes who transmitted it did not erase the antediluvian era. They preserved it alongside more grounded historical material. In this preservation lies a subtle tension. The king list presents a continuous line of succession, reaching into an age before catastrophe. It organises time into eras, separated by a deluge yet joined by memory. Whether that memory reflects symbolic cosmology or dim recollection of earlier societal forms remains open to interpretation. The text itself does not resolve the ambiguity. It records, enumerates, and moves forward. Thus, the Sumerian king list stands as both structure and question. It offers a disciplined sequence of names and reigns, while simultaneously extending the horizon of civilization into a realm that resists straightforward chronological placement. Within its ordered columns of cuneiform, the past appears both measured and immeasurable. Beyond the king list, other cuneiform texts recovered from Mesopotamian sites preserve accounts of a great flood that divides eras of human history. Among the most studied are fragments commonly referred to as the Eridu Genesis and the Atrahasis Epic. These tablets, found in various excavations including Nippur and Sippar, survive in incomplete forms. Their lines are broken at the edges, sections missing. Yet enough remains to reconstruct the broad outline of the narrative. The Eridu Genesis, preserved in Old Babylonian copies, describes the creation of humankind, the establishment of cities, and the decision of the gods to send a deluge. The text unfolds in measured sequence. A divine council convenes, a decree is issued, a warning is conveyed to a chosen individual, Ziusudra in Sumerian tradition. Instructions are given regarding the construction of a large vessel. The description is practical rather than ornate. Measurements, materials, and sealing processes are specified. The language resembles procedural guidance more than poetic flourish. The Atrahasis epic, recorded in Akkadian versions, elaborates further. It presents a theological rationale. Humanity has multiplied. Noise disturbs the gods. Balance must be restored. Again, the council deliberates. Enki, sympathetic to humankind, transmits instructions indirectly. The hero is told to dismantle his house and build a boat. The text includes directives about caulking with bitumen, loading animals, sealing the door. When the flood arrives, it is described as overwhelming yet finite. After days of storm, the waters subside. The vessel grounds, offerings are made, a covenantal adjustment follows, limiting human lifespan. In both accounts, the narrative is structured with internal coherence. It contains defined stages: pre-flood order, divine decision, preparation, inundation, restoration. The texts do not present themselves as speculative myth in the modern sense. They are copied, archived, and transmitted as part of a scribal tradition. Their preservation alongside administrative records suggests that they occupied a recognised intellectual space within Mesopotamian culture. Modern scholarship interprets these flood narratives within multiple frameworks. Some propose that they reflect localised river flooding in the alluvial plains of southern Iraq, where sudden inundations could devastate settlements. Archaeological excavations at sites such as Shuruppak and have revealed flood deposits within certain strata, though these layers are not synchronous across all cities. Others understand the flood as symbolic of cosmic reset, a theological motif marking the end of an era. It is possible to read these texts as layered compositions. On one level, they articulate divine-human relationships and moral order. On another, they may encode memory of environmental disruption. The specificity of construction instructions, the emphasis on materials and dimensions, has led some researchers to note their procedural tone. They resemble records of preparation rather than abstract allegory, yet caution remains necessary. The tablets we possess are copies, often centuries removed from the events they describe, if those events correspond to historical occurrences at all. Textual transmission in Mesopotamia involved adaptation and reinterpretation. Each copyist worked within a living tradition. Still, the persistence of the flood motif, carefully inscribed and preserved, reinforces its significance within the cultural memory of Sumer and Akkad. It functions as a hinge between epochs. Whether understood as theological narrative, environmental recollection, or symbolic cosmology, it marks a division between a distant age and the historical present known to the scribes. The flood in these records is neither chaotic fantasy nor casual metaphor. It is structured, deliberate, and embedded within the intellectual framework of early Mesopotamian society. And in that structure, the question of what preceded it remains quietly present. When archaeologists excavate ancient Mesopotamian cities such as Uruk or Eridu, they proceed downward through successive occupational layers, each stratum representing phases of construction, habitation, abandonment, and rebuilding. These layers are recorded in profiles, bands of soil differing in colour, texture, and composition. Within them are fragments of pottery, foundations of mud brick walls, ash deposits, and occasionally signs of abrupt environmental disturbance. At Uruk, deep soundings have revealed sequences stretching back into the late 5th and early 4th millennia, BCE. Monumental temple complexes rise from these strata, their platforms rebuilt repeatedly over centuries. Beneath the monumental phases lie earlier, more modest constructions, smaller shrines, domestic structures, traces of revolving urban layout. The progression appears incremental, suggesting continuity rather than sudden appearance. At Eridu, one of the cities associated in textual tradition with primordial kingship, excavations conducted in the mid-20th century exposed a series of superimposed temple levels. Beneath the later temple platform were earlier sanctuaries, each built atop the remains of its predecessor. The sequence extends deep into the Ubaid period, revealing religious continuity across centuries. In certain sections, however, archaeologists documented layers of alluvial sediment interposed between occupational phases, thin bands of silt indicating episodes of flooding. These flood deposits have been studied with caution. In some cases they appear localized, perhaps the result of river overflow or changes in watercourse. They do not uniformly signal a single catastrophic deluge across all Mesopotamian sites. Stratigraphic evidence indicates that different cities experienced flooding at different times. The geological record resists simplification, yet the presence of occupational breaks, periods where construction ceased, followed by rebuilding, invites reflection. Archaeology frequently reveals discontinuities. A layer of ash may indicate fire, a sterile band of sediment may indicate inundation. A shift in ceramic style may signal migration or cultural transformation. These are not extraordinary findings, but part of the texture of ancient settlement. The question arises not from the existence of such breaks, but from their cumulative effect. Beneath the earliest monumental architecture lie earlier communities whose material remains thinner, more difficult to interpret. As excavation descends further, the evidence becomes sparser. Mud brick dissolves over time, organic materials decay. What survives is fragmentary. Some researchers have considered whether earlier complex settlements may have existed in regions now altered by river shifts or buried beneath deeper sediment. Southern Mesopotamia is an alluvial plain, shaped continuously by the Tigris and Euphrates. Channels migrate, deltas expand, landforms transform. Sites once near water may now lie far from it. Others may be concealed beneath meters of later deposition. It would be premature to conclude from such geological dynamics that a fully developed, erased civilization lies hidden beneath the known layers. Archaeology proceeds through evidence, not absence. Still, the stratigraphic record demonstrates that urban life emerged atop earlier phases of habitation, some of which remain only partially understood. The cities of Sumer were not constructed upon empty ground. They rose from landscapes already inhabited, cultivated and ritualized. Each brick platform rests upon a sequence of earlier foundations. The deeper one excavates, the closer one approaches the threshold where settled life transitions into prehistory. Between the earliest documented temples and the indistinct layers below them lies a zone of uncertainty. Not dramatic, not sensational, but simply incomplete. It is within this incomplete zone that the possibility of earlier complexity is sometimes contemplated, always with restraint, and always guided by the measured patience of archaeological method. The flood narratives preserved in Sumerian and Akkadian tablets do not exist in isolation. Across widely separated regions and cultures, traditions of overwhelming waters appear in early mythological and historical corpora. These accounts differ in detail, theology, and cultural framing, yet their structural similarities invite careful comparison. In Mesopotamia, as we have seen, the flood is preceded by divine deliberation and followed by renewal. In ancient Hebrew tradition, recorded much later in the book of Genesis, a similar pattern unfolds. A decision is made by a singular deity, a righteous individual is warned, a vessel is constructed according to specific measurements, animals are gathered, waters cover the land, and a covenant establishes new conditions for humanity. The textual transmission differs, yet the narrative architecture bears resemblance. In certain Egyptian sources, while a global deluge motif is less central, there exist references to primeval waters and cycles of destruction and renewal. The coffin texts and later temple inscriptions speak of periods when the land returned to watery chaos before being re-established. The language is theological rather than historical, yet it reflects awareness of cyclical inundation within the Nile environment. Further east in early Indian literature, the Satapatha Brahmana recounts a flood story in which Manu is warned by a fish of impending catastrophe. A boat is constructed. Seeds of life are preserved. After the waters recede, creation resumes. In Mesoamerican traditions, including certain Maya and Aztec narratives recorded in post-contact codices, prior ages of humanity are said to have ended through water or environmental destruction before the current era emerged. these parallels do not necessitate direct contact or shared origin. Flooding is a universal human experience, particularly in riverine civilizations. The recurrence of water as an agent of destruction and renewal may arise independently in multiple contexts. Yet the structural correspondences, the chosen survivor, the vessel, the preservation of life, the demarcation between eras, form a recognizable pattern. Scholars of comparative mythology approach such patterns with caution. Similarity does not imply causation. Independent societies may generate analogous narratives in response to comparable environmental pressures. The psychological resonance of water as both life-giving and destructive may also contribute to the persistence of such motifs. However, when a motif appears across distant regions and within early textual layers, it raises questions about the depth of memory embedded in cultural storytelling. One interpretation suggests that repeated catastrophic flooding events during the late Pleistocene and early Holocene may have left enduring impressions on human communities. As populations migrated and settled, these impressions could have been reframed within local cosmologies. Another way to consider the parallels is through structural analysis. The flood narrative often functions as a boundary marker, separating an earlier age from the present order. It legitimizes new beginnings while acknowledging rupture. In this sense, it serves both historical and psychological purposes. The cross-cultural recurrence of flood traditions does not confirm the existence of a single erased civilization. It does, however, demonstrate that large-scale water events occupy a central place in early human memory. The narrative template, warning, preparation, inundation, survival, repeats with remarkable consistency. Whether these similarities reflect shared ancient experience, convergent myth-making, or a combination of both remains open. The pattern itself is observable, and within that pattern, even the possibility of deeper environmental or historical continuity invites measured reflection rather than definitive claim. To move from narrative tradition to measurable data, one must turn from clay tablets to ice cores, sediment layers, and marine terraces. Over the past several decades, paleoclimatology has reconstructed a detailed record of environmental change at the close of the last ice age. Around 12,900 years ago, the onset of the Younger Dryas introduced a sudden return to near-glacial conditions in parts of the northern hemisphere. Temperatures declined abruptly, glacial melt slowed, ecological systems adjusted under stress. Ice cores extracted from Greenland preserve annual layers of snowfall compacted into ice, each layer containing trapped air bubbles that record atmospheric composition. Within these cores, isotopic ratios shift sharply at the beginning and end of the Younger Dryas, marking rapid climatic transitions. Similarly, sediment cores from lake beds and ocean floors reveal changes in pollen distribution, charcoal content, and microfossil populations indicating shifts in vegetation and fire regimes. As the Younger Dryas concluded approximately 11,700 years ago, temperatures rose rapidly once more. Glaciers retreated. Massive volumes of meltwater entered the oceans, contributing to significant sea level rise during the early Holocene. Geological studies estimate that global sea levels rose by more than 100 meters between the last glacial maximum and the stabilization of coastlines several millennia later. The rise was not uniform. It occurred in pulses, sometimes accelerating over relatively short spans of centuries. These environmental shifts transformed landscapes. Coastal plains that had supported human habitation were gradually submerged. River systems adjusted their courses. Fertile corridors migrated. Archaeological evidence indicates that human populations during this period were widely dispersed, adapting to changing ecological niches. Sites once inland now lie beneath continental shelves. Submerged paleo-landscapes have been identified through sonar mapping in regions such as the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean. The connection between these climatic events and later Mesopotamian flood traditions cannot be drawn directly without caution. The Younger Dryas ended thousands of years before the emergence of urban Sumer. However, the cumulative memory of environmental instability may have been transmitted across generations through oral tradition. One interpretation suggests that rapid sea level rise could have displaced early coastal communities, compressing populations into new regions and altering social organisation. Geologists also study localised flood events within river systems. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers are prone to seasonal overflow. Changes in precipitation patterns and sediment load can intensify flooding. Alluvial plains accumulate silt during inundation, creating the very soils that later support agriculture. Thus, the same processes that threaten settlements also enable their prosperity. It is important to emphasize that no current geological evidence confirms a singular global flood event, corresponding precisely to Mesopotamian narratives. Instead, the data reveal complex patterns of climatic fluctuation, sea level rise, and regional flooding across millennia. These patterns demonstrate that human communities have repeatedly encountered environmental disruption on scales both local and continental. Scientific reconstruction stabilizes the inquiry. It situates flood traditions within a broader context of real climatic volatility. Rather than invoking sudden, unverified catastrophes, the geological record describes gradual yet profound transformation. Within such transformation, cultural memory may have taken narrative form. The interplay between environmental change and human adaptation is well documented. Societies respond to shifting coastlines, altered river courses, and resource redistribution over generations. These responses shape settlement patterns and social complexity. Whether the earlier stirrings of civilization were influenced by deep time climatic pressures remains an open field of study, approached with interdisciplinary care. In this measured expansion from myth to geology, the story becomes less dramatic yet more expansive. The Earth itself records its changes in ice and sediment. Human memory, inscribed later in clay, may echo fragments of those transitions, not as literal chronicle, but as cultural resonance carried forward across ages. Beyond geology, another line of evidence offers insight into humanity's deep past: population genetics. Over the past half-century, advances in DNA sequencing have allowed researchers to trace patterns of migration, isolation, and demographic contraction across millennia. By examining mitochondrial DNA passed maternally and Y chromosomal markers passed paternally, scientists reconstruct branching lineages that reveal how human populations expanded and occasionally narrowed in diversity. A genetic bottleneck occurs when a population undergoes significant reduction in size, whether through environmental catastrophe, disease, or migration. When numbers decline sharply, the genetic variability of the surviving group becomes compressed. Subsequent generations inherit a narrower range of genetic markers. Such bottlenecks are detectable through statistical modelling of mutation rates and haplogroup distribution. Evidence suggests that human populations experienced multiple bottlenecks during the late Pleistocene and early Holocene. Climatic volatility is including the fluctuations associated with the Younger Dryas, likely contributed to regional contractions. Groups inhabiting vulnerable coastal or riverine zones may have relocated, merging with neighbouring communities or dispersing into new territories. Over time, these movements shape the genetic landscape of Eurasia and beyond. In the Near East, genetic studies indicate complex layers of ancestry. Early agriculturalists of the Fertile Crescent appear to have contributed substantially to later populations of Europe and parts of Asia. Yet beneath this agricultural expansion lie deeper strata of hunter-gatherer ancestry, some of which trace back to refugia, regions that remained habitable during harsh climatic phases. As glaciers retreated, populations expanded outward from these refugia, intermingling and forming new cultural constellations. The relevance of such findings to the question of an erased civilization is indirect but instructive. Genetics does not reveal lost cities or forgotten temples. It reveals movement, contraction, and expansion. If significant environmental disruption occurred in prehistory, genetic signals might reflect population displacement or admixture events. Indeed, patterns of genetic mixing in the Near East suggest repeated waves of migration and cultural transformation long before the first written records. It is essential to maintain interpretive restraint. Genetic continuity does not confirm the presence of advanced urban societies prior to Sumer, nor does evidence of bottlenecks necessarily correspond to specific flood narratives. Our population dynamics are influenced by numerous factors: climate, subsistence strategies, conflict, technological innovation. However, genetics contributes an important stabilizing dimension. It demonstrates that human societies are not static. They contract, adapt, and reorganize in response to shifting environments. Cultural resets, periods in which previous social structures dissolve and new ones emerge, are consistent with patterns observed in both archaeological and genetic data. Some researchers have proposed that dramatic environmental events can accelerate social reconfiguration. If coastal or low-lying settlements were inundated during periods of sea level rise, displaced groups might have transmitted fragments of prior knowledge into new regions. Such transmission need not imply a technologically advanced precursor civilization, yet it may simply reflect continuity of human adaptation across disrupted landscapes. The genetic record underscores the resilience of human communities. Even after bottlenecks, populations expand and diversify once more. Languages evolve, myths crystallize, settlements coalesce. The emergence of Sumerian urbanism may thus represent not the beginning of complexity, but the visible crest of much older demographic currents. In this way, population genetics neither confirms nor denies the possibility of earlier organized societies. It situates humanity within a long arc of survival and movement. Beneath the inscriptions of kings and the foundations of temples lies a deeper biological continuity, one that has endured climatic upheaval and geographic transformation. The question is not whether humans lived before Sumer, but how their experiences were carried forward into the civilizations that eventually inscribed memory into clay. While Mesopotamia developed along the shifting banks of the Tigris and Euphrates, the Nile Valley followed its own gradual path toward complexity. Long before the unification traditionally dated to around 3100 BCE, communities were already settled along the river's fertile margins. Archaeologists classify these early cultural phases as Badarian and Naqada, extending back into the 5th and 4th millennia BCE. Within these periods, burial practices, ceramic styles, and settlement patterns reveal increasing social differentiation. Naqada culture in particular displays signs of growing stratification. Graves vary in size and richness. Some contain finely crafted pottery, stone vessels, and imported materials. Decorative motifs appear on ceramics, boats, animals, and geometric patterns, suggesting symbolic communication beyond mere utility. Over time, iconography becomes more formalized. Symbols later associated with pharaonic authority emerge in embryonic form. Archaeological evidence indicates that Upper Egypt, particularly around Hierakonpolis and Abydos, became a centre of political consolidation. Monumental tombs at Abydos, dating to the late Naqada III phase, show increasing architectural complexity. These precede the large stone pyramids by centuries, yet they demonstrate organised labour and ritual planning. Writing begins to appear in proto-hieroglyphic form, used initially for labelling and administrative purposes. Mainstream scholarship understands Egyptian civilization as developing largely within the Nile Valley and shaped by predictable annual inundation and agricultural stability. The river's flood cycle, unlike the more erratic behaviour of Mesopotamian rivers, provided consistent fertility. This environmental regularity may have fostered centralised governance and long-term planning. Yet Egypt was not isolated. Trade networks connected the Nile to the Levant, Nubia, and possibly the eastern Mediterranean. Artifacts of Near Eastern origin, such as certain pottery styles and cylinder seals, appear in pre-dynastic contexts. These items suggest interaction, though not necessarily dominance or external origin of Egyptian statehood. One interpretation proposes that knowledge circulated between regions during the late 4th millennium BCE. Administrative techniques, symbolic motifs, and technological practices may have travelled along trade routes. If Mesopotamia and Egypt developed near parallel systems of writing and governance, some degree of exchange is plausible. However, it is important to avoid overstating such connections. The material record does not support the existence of a singular precursor civilization that directly seeded both Egypt and Sumer. Instead, evidence points toward regional development influenced by environmental opportunity and limited cross-cultural contact. Still, the reconsideration of pre-dynastic Egypt introduces nuance. The rise of Egyptian civilization was not instantaneous. It emerged from centuries of social experimentation and incremental organization. Just as in Mesopotamia, beneath the monumental period lies a deeper stratum of formative communities whose full complexity remains partially obscured. If one entertains the possibility that environmental disruptions affected earlier populations in surrounding regions, Egypt's geographic position becomes relevant. The Nile Valley may have served as a refuge for displaced groups during periods of climatic instability. Some researchers have cautiously suggested that migration from the Levant or Mesopotamia could have contributed to cultural synthesis in the Nile region. Such proposals remain debated and require careful evidence. In reassessing pre-dynastic Egypt, we encounter a civilization whose origins are both documented and enigmatic. Its early phases demonstrate continuity and gradual intensification rather than abrupt insertion from elsewhere. Yet its emergence within a broader Near Eastern context invites contemplation of shared environmental and demographic currents. Nor Egypt and Sumer, long regarded as independent cradles of civilization, may represent parallel expressions of human adaptation during a period of ecological stabilization. Whether both drew from deeper, less visible antecedents remains uncertain. The archaeological record allows for complexity, but demands restraint in interpretation. Long before the formal archives of Sumer recorded shipments of copper and grain, human communities were already navigating coastlines and crossing stretches of open water. Archaeological evidence from the Persian Gulf region indicates that maritime exchange networks existed in rudimentary form during the 6th and 5th millennia BCE. Shell ornaments, bitumen fragments, and distinctive pottery styles appear across distant coastal settlements, suggesting patterns of contact that predate written documentation. The Persian Gulf itself during the late Pleistocene was not entirely submerged. Geological reconstructions indicate that lower sea levels exposed large tracts of land that are now underwater. As sea levels rose during the early Holocene, this basin gradually filled, transforming plains into marine corridors. Some researchers have proposed that early human communities may have inhabited these now submerged landscapes, adapting to shoreline shifts over generations. By the 3rd millennium BCE, Mesopotamian texts refer to Dilmun, Magan, and Meluha, regions associated with trade in copper, timber, and exotic goods. While these references belong to a later period than the earliest urban phases, they reveal established maritime routes. Boats capable of coastal travel were constructed from reeds and bitumen, materials abundant in the region, and cylinder seals and inscriptions record merchants operating across significant distances. Obsidian found in Mesopotamian sites has been traced through geochemical analysis to sources in Anatolia and beyond. Though much of this exchange likely occurred overland, some coastal transfer may have been involved. Similarly, certain shell species discovered inland must have originated from distant shores. These findings illustrate the interconnectedness of early communities. The existence of trade networks does not necessarily imply advanced nautical civilizations predating Sumer. Small-scale exchange can occur among relatively simple societies, yet maritime capacity introduces the possibility of broader contact zones than once assumed. If populations were displaced by rising waters or climatic shifts, they may have followed coastlines, carrying knowledge and material culture along migratory routes. Some researchers have cautiously suggested that submerged coastal settlements, now beneath continental shelves, could represent early hubs of interaction. Marine archaeology has identified ancient shorelines and possible habitation sites in shallow waters of the Gulf and Mediterranean. However, preservation underwater is complex. Organic materials decay, and sedimentation obscures structural remains. Evidence remains fragmentary. It is important to approach such proposals with measured skepticism. The presence of trade goods in archaeological context demonstrates exchange, not necessarily the existence of a singular erased civilization coordinating vast networks. Still, the sea has long functioned as both barrier and bridge. Even modest maritime technology expands the horizon of cultural interaction. In the absence of written records from these earlier periods, material traces serve as indirect testimony. A shard of pottery far from its origin, a bead carved from foreign stone, a seal motif echoing distant symbolism. These objects speak quietly of movement. As we consider the rise of Sumer and Egypt, maritime pathways remind us that human societies rarely develop in isolation. Exchange, adaptation, and mobility are constant features of prehistory. Whether deeper, now submerged landscapes once supported communities, whose influence lingers only in trade patterns, remains uncertain. The waters that connected regions also conceal them. In this interplay between land and sea, memory may travel even when settlements vanish. Icy trade routes leave faint lines across the map of antiquity, suggesting a world already more interconnected than the surviving texts alone might indicate. Language, once impressed into clay or carved into stone, becomes a durable trace of human thought. Among the early civilizations of the Near East, Sumerian occupies a distinctive position. It is widely regarded as linguistic isolate, meaning it shows no confirmed genetic relationship to any other known language family. This status has intrigued linguists for more than a century. Unlike Akkadian, which belongs to the Semitic family and shares structural affinities with later languages such as Hebrew and Arabic, Sumerian stands alone. The earliest cuneiform tablets, dating to the late 4th millennium BCE, contain proto-writing that gradually evolved into fully developed script. These early texts are primarily administrative, lists of commodities, allocations of labour, temple inventories. Over time, the script became capable of recording hymns, myths, and legal documents. The grammatical structure of Sumerian, its agglutinative morphology, its use of postpositions rather than prepositions, suggests a complex and mature language system by the time it appears in writing. The fact that Sumerian emerges in written form already sophisticated raises questions about its prehistory. Spoken languages develop gradually. Writing captures only a late stage of linguistic evolution. Therefore, the appearance of Sumerian in mature form implies centuries, perhaps millennia, of prior oral development. Where and how that development occurred remains uncertain. Some scholars have explored possible substrate influences in Sumerian vocabulary. Certain agricultural or technological terms may reflect borrowing from earlier or neighbouring languages. However, proposed connections to distant language families have not achieved consensus. The isolate classification persists, reinforcing the impression of a linguistic community whose deeper origins are obscured. In Egypt, hieroglyphic writing likewise appears in relatively advanced form during the late pre-dynastic period. While Egyptian belongs to the Afroasiatic language family, its written system emerges with remarkable rapidity. The simultaneity of writing systems in Mesopotamia and Egypt has prompted debate regarding independent invention versus diffusion of concept. Most scholars favour independent development, though acknowledging the possibility of limited contact. Linguistic continuity also leaves traces in place names and divine epithets. Certain Mesopotamian toponyms appear archaic, even within early texts, suggesting they were inherited from prior populations. The layering of languages across time can produce palimpsests, older words preserved beneath newer administrative systems. One interpretation suggests that linguistic isolates may reflect the survival of communities whose origins lie beyond the immediate archaeological horizon. If earlier populations occupied regions later absorbed into emerging states, their language might persist in ritual or administrative contexts, even as other cultural elements shifted. However, caution is essential. The absence of confirmed linguistic relatives does not confirm the existence of a vanished advanced civilization. It may simply reflect the limits of surviving data. Languages can disappear without leaving written traces. Entire speech communities may fade into larger populations over centuries. Still, language remains one of the most intimate carriers of memory. When scribes in Sumer pressed wedge-shaped signs into clay, they encoded a spoken world already ancient to them. The written record captures a moment in linguistic evolution, not its origin. In examining linguistic echoes, we encounter both continuity and opacity. Words endure, but their earliest context may be lost. The presence of a linguistic isolate at the dawn of recorded history invites reflection on what preceded writing. Voices unrecorded, conversations unpreserved, stories told beside rivers long before clay tablets entered temple archives. Among the many categories of cuneiform material recovered from Mesopotamian sites are tablets concerned with the observation of the sky. Some belong to later periods, particularly the first millennium BCE, when systematic astronomical recording reached remarkable precision. Yet even earlier texts contain references to celestial bodies, seasonal cycles, and ritual calendars aligned with lunar and solar rhythms. The Sumerians divided time through careful attention to the movements of the moon. Months were lunar, marked by the waxing crescent and full phase. Intercalary months were occasionally inserted to realign lunar cycles with the solar year. Such adjustments imply sustained observation across generations. The naming of months often reflected agricultural or religious activities tied to seasonal change. Certain early hymns and myths refer to prominent stars and constellations. The planet Venus, associated with the goddess Inanna, appears in textual tradition as a celestial entity with predictable appearances. Later Babylonian astronomers would record its cycles in extraordinary detail, but the roots of that attentiveness likely extend backward into earlier periods of sky watching. The construction of ziggurats, stepped temple platforms, has sometimes been interpreted as reflecting cosmological symbolism. Their orientation toward cardinal directions suggests awareness of solar patterns. In Egypt, pyramids and temple complexes likewise exhibit astronomical alignment, calibrated to solstices or specific stellar risings. Such alignments demonstrate not mysticism, but disciplined observation over time. It is important to avoid retrojecting advanced astronomical science into eras where evidence remains limited. The early Sumerian texts do not contain precise star catalogues, comparable to later Babylonian compendia such as Mul-Apin. However, the presence of calendrical structure indicates practical engagement with the sky. Some researchers have proposed that certain numerical patterns in early king lists may reflect astronomical cycles rather than literal reign lengths. This interpretation remains debated. While sexagesimal mathematics later facilitated sophisticated astronomical calculation, applying that framework to antediluvian chronology requires careful argument. If we consider the possibility that early agricultural societies depended heavily on seasonal predictability, sustained sky observation would have been essential. Flood timing, planting cycles, and ritual events were coordinated through celestial markers. Over generations, accumulated observations could crystallize into symbolic narratives, linking heavenly order with earthly kingship. Another way to read astronomical references in early texts is as continuity of inherited knowledge. Even if writing first appears in the late 4th millennium BCE, oral traditions of celestial observation may have extended much earlier. Agricultural communities long before Sumer likely watched the sky for practical guidance, yet none of this necessitates a lost advanced astronomical civilization preceding Egypt and Mesopotamia. The evidence supports incremental development, observation refined through repetition, codified gradually into formal systems. Complexity does not always require sudden origin. Still, the sky offers a stable reference across eras. Generations separated by centuries observe the same stars rising above river valleys. If cultural memory persisted through periods of environmental disruption, celestial cycles may have provided continuity when terrestrial landscapes changed. In this sense, astronomical awareness becomes a quiet thread connecting prehistory and recorded history. The heavens were constant even as rivers shifted course. Early texts reflect this orientation upward, not as spectacle, but as practical necessity woven into the fabric of early civilization. Up to this point, the inquiry has remained grounded in artifacts, stratigraphy, climate data, genetics, language, and measured comparison. Each discipline offers fragments of a larger mosaic, yet within the spaces between those fragments, interpretive possibilities emerge. It is here, carefully and without haste, that speculation may be introduced, not as conclusion, but as structured contemplation. What if the flood traditions preserved in Mesopotamian tablets encode memory not merely of seasonal river overflow, but of more extensive environmental transformation? One interpretation suggests that as sea levels rose rapidly during the early Holocene, vast coastal plains, once habitable and perhaps agriculturally productive, were gradually inundated. Communities living in those regions would have faced displacement. Their settlements, if constructed primarily of organic materials, might now lie beneath continental shelves beyond the reach of conventional excavation. If we consider the Persian Gulf basin during periods of lower sea level, geological reconstructions indicate that it may have functioned as a fertile corridor. Rivers would have converged into a broad, low-lying plain before emptying into the open ocean. Some researchers have proposed that this region could have supported sustained human occupation prior to its inundation. Such proposals remain tentative, dependent upon limited marine surveys and sediment analysis. Another way to approach the possibility of an erased precursor is through cultural transmission. If earlier organized communities existed in regions later submerged or geologically transformed, their knowledge might not vanish entirely. Priestly classes, ritual specialists, heir or migrating families could have carried fragments of memory into emerging settlements along stable river systems. In this scenario, the antediluvian kings of the Sumerian king list might represent symbolic echoes of a pre-existing social order remembered in compressed form. Some researchers have argued that the extraordinary rain lengths recorded before the flood may reflect attempts to encode vast spans of time, perhaps referencing epochs rather than individuals. Others suggest that the flood boundary in textual tradition marks the end of an earlier cycle of human organization, whether mythic or historical, followed by reconstitution under new environmental conditions. It is essential to maintain intellectual restraint. There is at present no conclusive archaeological evidence for a fully developed, yet globally connected civilization predating Sumer and Egypt. The absence of such evidence must temper any speculative model. However, absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence, particularly in regions now submerged or deeply buried beneath alluvial sediment. If we consider the possibility that early Holocene environmental volatility displaced organized communities, the emergence of visible urbanism in Mesopotamia and Egypt might represent not the first experiment in complexity, but the most archaeologically accessible one. Earlier experiments, less materially durable or geographically preserved, may have left subtler traces, myths, numerical anomalies, linguistic isolates. Such speculation does not demand acceptance. It invites contemplation. It asks whether the transition from prehistory to history was as abrupt as it appears, or whether it conceals longer arcs of development interrupted by environmental change. The erased precursor, if it existed, need not have resembled later empires. It may have been modest, regionally organised, technologically limited by comparison. Its erasure would not require cataclysm of cinematic scale, only gradual inundation, sedimentation, and the slow forgetting that accompanies migration. In raising these possibilities, the intention is not to replace mainstream chronology, but to explore its margins. The space between geological data and textual memory remains open. Within that space, one may cautiously consider the idea that civilization, like the rivers that sustain it, may have shifted channels more than once before settling into forms we now recognize. When communities experience disruption, whether environmental, social, or political, the memory of that disruption rarely disappears. It transforms. Oral traditions compress complex events into symbolic narratives. Trauma becomes mythic sequence. Over generations, precise details fade, yet structural elements endure. In this way, cultures preserve memory not through literal chronicle, but through encoded story. Anthropologists have long observed that oral societies transmit foundational events through ritual repetition. Catastrophes are retold in ways that emphasize moral lessons, cosmic order, or divine intervention. The historical kernel may be small, but the narrative architecture is durable. Flood stories, creation cycles, and genealogies of primordial rulers often serve this function. They anchor identity to a deep past, even when the factual contours of that past cannot be verified in material form. Psychological research into collective memory suggests that groups reinterpret past crises to stabilize present meaning. A devastating flood may become a divine reset. A migration forced by drought may be reframed as a sacred journey. The act of storytelling integrates rupture into continuity. Memory thus becomes both preservation and adaptation. In the case of Mesopotamian flood traditions and antediluvian kingship, one might consider the possibility that symbolic exaggeration masks emotional intensity. Long-reign lengths may communicate antiquity and magnitude rather than numerical accuracy. The flood-dividing eras may signify a profound cultural break, whether environmental or social, experienced as boundary in communal consciousness. Such encoding does not imply deception. It reflects the limitations and strengths of human memory. Without written chronicle, societies rely on narrative form. Over centuries, stories condense and expand simultaneously. Condense in detail, expand in symbolic weight. The result is neither purely factual nor purely fictional. It occupies a middle terrain where memory and meaning intersect. If early populations encountered dramatic landscape transformation, rising waters, shifting rivers, disappearing settlements, the psychological impact would have been substantial. Subsequent generations born into new environments might preserve ancestral memory in ritual language rather than topographical precision. The emotional truth of loss could outlast the geographic specifics. At the same time, caution is required. Not every myth encodes historical trauma. Symbolic narratives can arise independently of literal catastrophe. Flood motifs may represent purification, renewal, or cosmic balance without referencing specific events. Still, the psychology of civilizational memory provides a framework for understanding how fragments of earlier experience might persist long after material traces have faded. Stories become vessels, carrying compressed recollection across centuries. Inscriptions later formalize those stories, giving them administrative or theological structure. As we consider the possibility of erased antecedents to known civilizations, the role of memory becomes central. Whether or not a precursor society existed, the narratives preserved in clay tablets reflect deep concern with origin and rupture. They speak of boundaries between ages, of survival through transformation. Before we proceed further, it may be useful to pause. Reflect not on definitive answers, but on the complexity of memory itself. Consider how cultures carry their past forward, sometimes clearly, sometimes obliquely. Continue listening with openness to layered meaning, without urgency for conclusion. In both Mesopotamia and Egypt, the rise of monumental architecture coincides with the consolidation of political and religious authority. Ziggurats in cities such as Ur and Uruk rose above surrounding dwellings, their stepped platforms elevating temples toward the sky. In Egypt, pyramids and mortuary complexes aligned with cardinal directions, constructed with extraordinary precision. These structures were not merely functional, they were statements in brick and stone. The building of a ziggurat required coordinated labour, surplus resources and administrative organisation. Each successive layer was constructed atop earlier foundations, physically embodying continuity. The repetition of rebuilding at the same sacred location reinforced memory. The site itself became an anchor, tying present authority to ancestral precedent. Similarly, Egyptian pyramids were constructed within established necropolises, often near earlier tombs. The orientation of these monuments towards celestial events reflects sustained observation and ritual integration. Their scale suggests long-term planning, yet their symbolism roots them in cycles of death and renewal. Some scholars interpret monumental architecture as a stabilizing response to uncertainty. In environments where rivers shift and floods recur, durable structures assert order against impermanence. Brick platforms resist inundation, elevated temples rise above floodplain. Architecture thus becomes both practical adaptation and symbolic reassurance. It is possible to consider whether such monumental expression functions as cultural memory device. When earlier forms of settlement or ritual practice are disrupted by environmental change or social transformation, new structures may encode continuity in altered form. The elevation of sacred space might echo earlier high ground refuges. The layering of platforms may symbolize temporal accumulation. However, the evidence does not require a lost advanced predecessor to explain these developments. Monumentality can emerge gradually from increasing social complexity. Agricultural surplus supports specialized labor. Religious institutions coordinate communal effort. The progression from modest shrine to multi-tiered ziggurat may reflect incremental growth rather than inherited blueprint. Still, the persistence of certain architectural orientations and symbolic geometries invites reflection. Across regions, sacred structures align with cardinal directions, solstices, or prominent celestial bodies. Whether these similarities arise independently or through limited exchange remains debated. Architecture endures when other materials decay. Mud brick dissolves slowly, stone more slowly still. Even when cities are abandoned, their foundations remain detectable beneath sediment. If earlier settlements existed in regions later submerged or transformed, their architectural traces may be less accessible, especially if constructed of perishable materials. In contemplating monumentality as memory, here we observe how civilizations externalize identity. Stone and brick preserve continuity beyond individual lifespans. They stabilize narrative through physical form. The ziggurat and the pyramid stand not only as achievements of engineering, but as repositories of collective intention. Within their ascending tiers, one may discern both confidence and remembrance. Confidence in organized society, remembrance of origins. Whether those origins extend further back than currently documented remains uncertain. Yet the act of building upwards suggests awareness of time layered beneath. Each foundation rests upon earlier ground, visible or obscured. In this way, monumental architecture offers both evidence of established civilization and subtle testimony to what preceded it. It does not prove an erased precursor. It does, however, and demonstrate humanity's impulse to anchor memory in durable form. Across the globe, continental shelves slope gently outward from present coastlines, concealing vast tracts of land that were exposed during periods of lower sea level. During the last glacial maximum, approximately 20,000 years ago, global sea levels were more than 100 metres lower than today. Shorelines extended far beyond their current positions. River valleys cut deeper channels across what are now shallow seas. Human populations inhabiting coastal plains would have occupied terrain that is presently submerged. Marine geologists reconstruct these ancient landscapes through sonar mapping, sediment cores, and bathymetric surveys. In the Persian Gulf, seismic imaging reveals paleo river systems converging toward what would have been a fertile basin, before gradual inundation during the early Holocene. The filling of this basin occurred over millennia, as meltwater from retreating glaciers raised global sea levels. By around 6,000 to 7,000 years ago, much of the Gulf had assumed its modern configuration. Similar submerged paleo landscapes have been identified in the North Sea, the Mediterranean, and along the coasts of Southeast Asia. In some regions, stone tools and structural remains have been recovered from shallow waters, demonstrating that human habitation once extended into areas now underwater. These findings confirm that rising seas displaced communities repeatedly over the course of prehistory. The challenge lies in preservation. Coastal settlements often relied on organic materials, wood, reed, packed earth, that degrade rapidly under marine conditions. Even where structural remnants survive, sediment accumulation may bury them beneath meters of deposit. Underwater archaeology requires specialized equipment and remains limited in scope compared to terrestrial excavation. In the context of Mesopotamia and Egypt, the possibility arises that early Holocene communities occupied low-lying coastal or riverine zones later submerged or deeply buried beneath alluvium. If organized settlements existed in such regions, their material traces would be difficult to access. The absence of direct evidence may reflect geological concealment rather than historical non-existence. However, caution is necessary. While submerged landscapes certainly hosted human populations, current marine surveys have not revealed unmistakable evidence of a complex urban civilization predating Sumer and Egypt. Findings thus far consist primarily of small-scale habitation sites, tool assemblages, and scattered artifacts. The scale of known submerged settlements does not match the infrastructural complexity of later urban centres. Some researchers propose that early experimentation in agriculture and settlement could have occurred along these now submerged coasts, contributing indirectly to later developments inland. If sea level rise displaced such communities, they may have migrated toward more stable river systems, carrying knowledge of cultivation and organisation. This line of reasoning remains hypothetical. Geological data confirm that landscapes have been lost beneath rising seas. Archaeology confirms that humans inhabited those landscapes. What remains uncertain is the degree of complexity those communities achieved prior to inundation. Marine geology thus tempers both skepticism and enthusiasm. It acknowledges the plausibility of erased coastal settlements, while underscoring the scarcity of direct evidence for advanced precursor civilizations. The ocean conceals much, but not everything. In contemplating submerged landscapes, we confront the fragility of physical record. Coastlines shift, river deltas expand, entire plains disappear beneath water. Human memory may persist in narrative, but architecture and inscription require stable ground. Where ground was lost, traces may be scattered or sealed. The geological record invites patience. It reminds us that absence in the archaeological archive can result from environmental transformation rather than historical emptiness. Yet it also cautions against filling silence with certainty. Beneath the waters lie stories still incomplete, awaiting careful exploration without presumption. After tracing artifacts, texts, climate shifts, genetics, architecture, and submerged landscapes, it becomes necessary to return to methodological ground. The established academic framework situates the earliest confirmed urban civilizations in southern Mesopotamia, and along the Nile during the 4th millennium BCE. This framework rests upon extensive excavation, cross-dated strata, radiocarbon analysis, and comparative philology. Its conclusions are not arbitrary, they are cumulative. The possibility of earlier complex societies remains a subject of inquiry, but it has not yet been substantiated by direct, unambiguous evidence. No excavated site currently demonstrates the administrative infrastructure, monumental architecture, and writing systems characteristic of Sumer or pre-dynastic Egypt at a significantly earlier date. Where evidence is fragmentary or submerged, interpretation must remain provisional. Speculation can illuminate margins, but it must not displace documentation. Flood traditions, antediluvian king lists, and geological transformations invite thoughtful reflection, yet they do not override material findings. The absence of confirmed precursor cities does not prove impossibility, but it does define the limits of responsible assertion. Archaeology advances through careful accumulation, where each season of excavation refines chronology incrementally, underwater surveys expand slowly, genetic research clarifies population movement without narrating lost empires. The intellectual integrity of historical inquiry depends upon this restraint. It remains plausible that early Holocene communities along now submerged coastlines contributed indirectly to later civilizational development. It remains conceivable that textual traditions encode memory of environmental upheaval older than recorded history. Yet plausibility differs from proof. The dominant narrative, that Sumer and Egypt represent humanity's earliest urban civilizations presently confirmed, continues to withstand scrutiny. Within that narrative, room exists for nuance, for regional variation, for deeper pre-urban complexity. What it does not currently support is a fully formed, technologically advanced civilization erased wholesale before Egypt. Acknowledging these limits does not diminish the wonder of inquiry. Rather, it protects it from distortion. The past is vast and its reconstruction requires humility. Where evidence accumulates, conclusions may form. Where silence persists, openness must remain. In this measured rebalancing, the conversation returns to solid ground. The clay tablets in museum cases, the stratified ruins beneath desert soil, the isotopic signatures locked in ice. These remain our anchors. They speak clearly within the scope of what they reveal. Beyond that scope, speculation may continue cautiously, always tethered to method. The erased civilization, if it ever existed, has yet to leave traces commensurate with the cities of Ur or Memphis. Until such traces are found, the conventional chronology stands, not as dogma, but as the most coherent model supported by current evidence. In recognizing both possibility and limitation, intellectual integrity is preserved. The inquiry remains open, but not untethered. When one surveys the arc of history from the vantage point of deep time, a recurring pattern emerges. Societies gather, flourish, consolidate, and eventually transform or dissolve. Cities rise from riverbanks, draw resources inward, codify belief systems, and project stability through architecture and inscription. Yet beneath their permanence lies fragility. Climate shifts, trade routes alter, political cohesion weakens, and what once seemed enduring becomes sediment. The cities of Sumer themselves illustrate this rhythm. Uruk expanded, dominated, and later diminished. Akkadian power rose and receded. Egyptian dynasties flourished across centuries, yet Old Kingdom grandeur gave way to periods of decentralization. None of these collapses erased humanity, but each reconfigured memory and structure. If earlier organized communities existed before documented urbanism, they too would have participated in this cyclical pattern. Environmental transformation alone, rising seas, shifting rivers, could compel abandonment without dramatic warfare or sudden catastrophe. Over generations, displaced populations would adapt, reassemble, and begin anew. In that renewal, fragments of prior knowledge might persist, though their original context fades. The notion of cycles does not require romanticising a lost golden age. It simply acknowledges that human organisation is contingent upon environmental and social equilibrium. Stability is negotiated, not guaranteed. Even our current global civilization rests upon climatic conditions that, historically speaking, are relatively recent and unusually stable. To reflect upon civilizational cycles is to confront impermanence. Monumental architecture may endure for millennia, yet even stone erodes. Clay tablets survive in dry soil, yet countless others dissolve in moisture. Memory narrows, expands, reshapes. In the quiet of this realization, the search for an erased precursor shifts from spectacle to contemplation. Whether or not a complex society preceded Egypt and Sumer, the broader lesson remains: human achievements are vulnerable to forces beyond immediate control. Rivers carve new channels. Seas advance and retreat. Cultural forms adapt. This awareness invites humility rather than alarm. It situates present inquiry within a continuum of rise and transformation. Civilizations do not vanish into nothingness. They metamorphose, leaving traces, some visible, others subtle. As the pace of reflection slows, the emphasis moves from discovery to perspective. The clay tablet in Oxford is one fragment in a long sequence of human attempts to anchor time. It reminds us that every era believes itself stable, yet every era rests upon shifting ground. In acknowledging fragility, one need not succumb to pessimism. Instead, there is a quiet recognition that continuity depends upon adaptation. The past demonstrates resilience as much as loss. Even after upheaval, communities reorganize and memory finds new form. And thus, the contemplation of erased civilizations becomes less about hidden grandeur and more about the rhythms that shape all human societies. The question is not solely what was lost, but how renewal follows disappearance. Within that rhythm, humanity persists. In the Ashmolean Museum, the clay tablet rests behind glass, its cuneiform impressions catching faint light. Outside, evening settles across Oxford's stone facades. The air cools, footsteps diminish in the corridors. Within the case, the tablet remains as it has for centuries, silent, patient, bearing the weight of names and numbers pressed into its surface long ago. Far away, in the plains of southern Iraq, the Tigris and Euphrates continue their slow passage toward the sea. Their waters move without memory of individual cities, yet they flow past mounds that conceal foundations of temples and homes. Beneath layers of sediment, earlier ground lies hidden. Beneath submerged shelves, former shorelines rest in darkness. The night sky arches above both museum and river valley. The same constellations once observed by Sumerian scribes rise again, steady and unhurried. The moon reflects faintly upon water, recalling cycles older than inscription. In that quiet repetition, time feels expansive rather than linear. Whether an erased civilization once flourished before Egypt, whether coastal settlements vanished beneath rising seas, whether memory preserved fragments of deeper antiquity, these questions remain open. The evidence invites curiosity, yet it also invites calm. Not all mysteries require resolution. Allow the cadence of rivers and breath to align. Inhale slowly, as though tracing the path of water through delta channels. Exhale gently, as though watching sediment settle upon ancient ground. The past does not press for certainty. It unfolds in layers. The tablet endures. The rivers endure. Human inquiry endures. Beyond conclusions and beyond speculation lies continuity, the quiet persistence of story, inscribed and uninscribed alike. If this exploration has accompanied your evening reflection, you may return to it again in time. There is no urgency, only the steady current of history flowing beneath the surface of thought. Night deepens over the rivers. Clay cools in its case. The sky turns, untroubled, above lands that have risen, flourished, and transformed. In that stillness the inquiry rests, not ended, but at peace within the vastness of what remains unknown.